History often meets certain figures, already shouting. Their names arrive carrying noise. Stories honed into extremes, genius or monster, builder or destroyer. By the time we encounter them, the human shape beneath the legend has usually been worn smooth by repetition. Shaka Zulu is one of those figures. He is remembered as a storm, a force, a man who reorganized war, reshaped societies, and left entire regions altered in his wake. But storms do not begin in the open sky. They gather quietly, under pressure. Most people never notice the gathering. What tends to disappear in the retelling is not what Shaka did, but what it took to become someone capable of doing it. Not strategy alone, not ambition alone, but a particular relationship with fear, discipline, and control. This is not a story told to praise violence, nor is it told to reduce a life to cruelty. It is an attempt to understand how power forms when survival feels uncertain, when belonging is fragile, and when order begins to feel like safety in a dangerous world. We are not here to weigh Shaka on a moral scale and announce a verdict. History is already crowded with verdicts. Instead, we will move slowly. We will follow pressure as it builds. We will watch how discipline replaces vulnerability, how control becomes a language, and how a single human life can harden into a system that outlives the person who created it. Along the way, some moments will feel unsettling. Others may feel uncomfortably familiar. That is intentional, because the most enduring stories are not the ones that tell us what to think, but the ones that quietly ask what we recognize. This is not the story of a monster or a hero. It is the story of what can happen when fear, order, and ambition align at the right moment in history. And once they do, they tend to continue long after anyone is asking them to. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night. Others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this, only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Shaka's story does not begin with command. It begins with exposure. He was born into a world where lineage was protection and legitimacy was a kind of shelter. To be recognized by a father was not only a matter of affection, but of survival. Shaka did not have that shelter. His mother, Namdi, was not accepted as a permanent wife by Sensanjakona, and the child that came from their union carried that uncertainty from the moment he arrived. In communities where memory traveled by word and reputation, this mattered. People knew who belonged. They knew who did not, and children especially knew where they stood. Shaka grew up aware of eyes on him, of whispers that did not stop when he entered a space, of laughter that arrived just a little too late. This was not a dramatic exile at first. It was quieter than that. The kind of vulnerability that teaches alertness long before it teaches anger. When Shaka and his mother were eventually pushed out, moving between groups who offered temporary refuge, the lesson sharpened. Survival depended on reading moods quickly, on noticing when hospitality thinned, on understanding when to stay silent and when to disappear. Children raised in safety learn trust. Children raised in exposure learn pattern. Shaka learned how quickly belonging could evaporate, how status could shift in a sentence, how weakness, once noticed, rarely went untested. There is a temptation, in hindsight, to treat this period as destiny forming itself neatly. But nothing about it would have felt purposeful at the time. It would have felt unstable, precarious, exhausting, each day shaped less by ambition than by avoidance. Avoiding insult, avoiding hunger, avoiding attention that could turn sharp. Shaka watched other boys closely. Who was protected? Who was mocked? Who could take space without consequence? Who could not? These observations were not philosophical. They were practical. They were about staying intact. Strength, he learned, was not only physical. It was social. It came from recognition, from standing inside a structure that would hold when challenged. Without that structure, even the strong could be made fragile. And so, long before Shaka ever commanded anyone, he understood what it meant to be unshielded. He understood what it meant to live without margin. This matters because power rarely begins as desire. More often, it begins as compensation. When safety is unreliable, order becomes attractive. When belonging is fragile, control feels stabilizing. Shaka did not yet have the means to impose either, but the need was already present. He was not dreaming of conquest. He was learning what it felt like to have nothing absorb a blow meant for you. What it felt like to stand alone when pressure arrived. Those sensations settle deep. They do not fade with time. They wait. In later years, people would describe Shaka as unusually disciplined, as intolerant of weakness, as someone who demanded cohesion and punished fracture without hesitation. Those qualities did not appear suddenly. They grew slowly, in the quiet years when survival depended on vigilance, when belonging was conditional, and when disorder carried real consequences. This is not an excuse. It is not a justification. It is an origin, because before Shaka became a force that reshaped others, he was a child learning what it meant to be reshaped by the world, repeatedly, without consent. And that kind of learning leaves a mark. Exile does not teach strength all at once. It teaches timing. After being pushed from the fragile protection of his father's world, Shaka and his mother moved through other communities where hospitality came with limits. They were allowed to stay, but not to settle. Welcomed, but never fully absorbed. Each place offered safety only as long as it remained convenient. This kind of life narrows your focus. You stop asking what people say and start watching what they do. Who is generous when resources are thin? Who grows rigid when challenged? Who is respected without raising their voice? Shaka learned early that survival did not belong to the loudest or the strongest. It belonged to those who understood the rules of a space before breaking them, to those who sensed when the mood of a group was turning and adjusted before it did. There was no room for pride here. Pride attracted attention. Attention invited testing. So Shaka watched. He watched how men stood when elders spoke. He watched which gestures earned approval and which earned silence. He watched how conflict was ritualized, contained, or allowed to spill. What he absorbed during these years was not doctrine, it was pattern. Eventually, he and his mother found more stable refuge among the Methwa. Compared to earlier hosts, this was a world that valued organization. Leadership was clearer, authority was visible. Order existed not as tradition alone, but as coordination. For Shaka, this mattered. A structured environment reveals something crucial to someone raised without protection, that power does not have to be chaotic. It can be arranged, repeated, maintained. He did not enter this world as a commander. He entered it quietly, observing how age groups were organized, how loyalty was rewarded, how discipline was enforced without constant violence. Here, survival did not depend on improvisation alone. It depended on fit. Shaka adjusted. He learned when to hold back and when to step forward, when to blend into a group and when to distinguish himself just enough to be noticed without becoming exposed. The habits formed earlier, vigilance, restraint, emotional control, now found a setting where they could be used rather than merely endured. This is an important distinction. Adaptation is not ambition. It is responsiveness. It is the ability to survive changing conditions without demanding that the world soften first. Shaka did not yet reshape anything. He reshaped himself. He learned that fear could be managed if it was predictable. That effort could be coordinated if expectations were clear. That disorder was not inevitable. It was often tolerated. These realizations did not arrive as thoughts. They arrived as relief. For someone raised in uncertainty, structure feels like breathing room. It offers something to lean against, something that absorbs impact, something that reduces the need to constantly scan for danger. Shaka did not speak about these things. He stored them. And as he grew older, something subtle began to shift. The child who once avoided attention began to understand how attention could be directed. But it was proximity. He was learning the difference between surviving a system and belonging to one, between enduring pressure and organizing it, between reacting to fear and placing it carefully where it would do work for you. In the years ahead, Shaka would become known for decisiveness and control. Those traits would later be mistaken for temperament. But here, in these quieter years, they were simply tools, learned slowly, without ceremony, forged by the need to remain intact in a world that had once offered him no shelter at all. Shaka did not discover power by overpowering others. He discovered it by noticing what happened when chaos was reduced. Within them, Thethwa, conflict was not absent, but it was contained. Disputes followed forms. Violence, when it occurred, was bounded by expectation rather than impulse. For someone raised in uncertainty, this difference mattered more than strength ever could. Shaka entered military life, not as a prodigy, but as an observer. He paid attention to what failed, to moments where men hesitated, to gaps between intention and execution, to how disorder crept in, not through weakness, but through confusion. What he saw unsettled him. Combat was loud, but inefficient, ritualized, fought at a distance that allowed fear to linger without resolution. Men postured, retreated, regrouped. Losses were accepted as part of the pattern, as if waste were inevitable. No one seemed disturbed by how long fear was allowed to circulate. Shaka was disturbed, not because he loved violence, but because he understood exposure. Prolonged conflict extended vulnerability. Every hesitation widened the space where panic could take hold. Every uncoordinated movement made individuals visible in the worst possible way. The problem, as he saw it, was not courage, it was structure. Why were battles arranged to stretch instead of conclude? Why were warriors trained to threaten rather than finish? Why was fear treated as something to endure instead of something to control? These were not philosophical questions. They were practical ones, shaped by lived experience. If fear was inevitable, then it should be shortened. If conflict was unavoidable, then it should be decisive. Shaka began to advocate for closer engagement, for formations that moved as units rather than scattered bodies, for training that emphasized repetition until response became automatic. Discipline, not as punishment, but as synchronization. What mattered was not how hard a man struck, but whether he struck when expected, not how brave he felt, but whether he moved with others. This was the revelation. Strength did not need to be heroic, it needed to be coordinated. Under leaders willing to listen, some of these ideas were tested. Training grew harsher, but also clearer. Expectations were explicit. Failure was punished, but ambiguity was eliminated. Warriors knew what was required of them and what would happen if they broke formation. Fear did not disappear. It changed shape. Instead of spreading sideways through uncertainty, it was pushed forward, directed outward, contained within structure. Men no longer carried fear alone. It was absorbed by the group and redirected as momentum. For Shaka, this was not cruelty, it was relief. Discipline removed guesswork. It replaced improvisation with certainty. It reduced the need for constant vigilance by building reliability into the group itself. A man did not need to scan constantly for danger when the formation around him was predictable. This distinction mattered deeply to someone whose early life had been defined by standing alone when pressure arrived. What began as refinement soon hardened into conviction. Discipline was not merely a military advantage, it was a way of organizing fear so it did not turn inward, a way of making order visible, repeatable, and enforceable. A way of ensuring that vulnerability was shared rather than concentrated on the exposed. As these practices took hold, Shaka's reputation shifted. He was no longer merely adaptable. He was precise, demanding, intolerant of deviation. Some admired this clarity, others resented its cost. Shaka did not soften in response. Softness, he had learned, did not protect anyone. Structure did. By this point, something irreversible had occurred. Adaptation had given way to intention. Observation had hardened into design. Discipline was no longer a response to insecurity. It was becoming a principle. And principles, once proven effective, rarely remain confined. They seek scale. Discipline, once it becomes visible, rarely stays private for long. Shaka's methods did not spread because they sounded impressive. They spread because they reduced uncertainty. Movements tightened. Engagements ended sooner. Confusion decreased. Fear, though still present, no longer leaked through gaps in coordination. It was contained by expectation and absorbed by structure. In a world shaped by recurring conflict, reliability draws attention. Authority tends to notice the people who make outcomes predictable. Within the Mthethwa, leadership was not only a matter of inheritance, it was shaped by usefulness. Those who could organize men, hold cohesion, and deliver results gained proximity to decision-making. Shaka's value lay not in charm, but in coherence. He made groups behave consistently under pressure where others relied on bravado, ritual, or luck. That consistency mattered. Dingiswayo, the Mthethwa leader, governed through coordination rather than domination. His influence grew by uniting groups that might otherwise fracture. He understood that cohesion could outlast intimidation, and the discipline, when applied with clarity, could multiply loyalty instead of exhausting it. Shaka fit into this environment. He was not elevated suddenly, nor handed authority without scrutiny. He was watched, tested, given responsibility in measured increments. Each time he responded not by asserting himself theatrically, but by refining process. When mistakes occurred, they were corrected in a way that reinforced the system rather than merely punishing the individual. This is how power often enters a life. Quietly, indirectly, through permission rather than conquest. Shaka learned something essential during this period. Control does not begin with command. It begins with alignment. When rules are shared, enforcement feels less personal. When expectations are visible, discipline seems less arbitrary. Men resist less when they understand what is required and what failure will cost. They may not love the demand, but they can at least predict it, and predictability reduces panic. Under Dingiswayo's protection, Shaka's ideas gained space to deepen. Training intensified. Organization hardened. Loyalties slowly shifted from personal bonds to structural ones. Warriors were no longer following a man alone. They were operating inside a pattern that promised consistency in moments when instinct would otherwise scatter them. For Shaka, this alliance offered more than resources. It offered legitimacy. Legitimacy absorbs risk. A man acting alone is exposed. His failures are amplified. His severity invites challenge. A man acting within authority is buffered. Experiments become tolerable. Discipline can sharpen without immediately provoking collapse. This mattered to someone whose early life had been defined by standing unshielded when pressure arrived. Within the partnership, Shaka's severity began to read as purposeful rather than excessive. Demands that might have been rejected elsewhere were accepted here because they produced stability. Precision stopped looking like threat and began to look like competence. But alliances impose limits. Shaka was still operating inside a hierarchy that was not his own. His authority was borrowed. His influence depended on remaining aligned with Dingiswayo's broader aims. This required restraint. The discipline he valued had to be applied upward as well as outward. Ambition had to learn pacing. He complied. And the compliance was not weakness. It was calculation. Power that accelerates too fast exposes itself. Power that grows inside existing structures gains time. Shaka did not yet need independence. He needed room. That harshness is tolerated longer when it is justified by results. That people will accept difficult demands when those demands feel coherent rather than personal. It also taught him that borrowed power can vanish suddenly, and that a system built on permission must be prepared for the moment permission is withdrawn. So Shaka waited, and while he waited, his presence began to reorganize the behavior of those around him. Men adjusted their movements in anticipation of his expectations. Discipline no longer required constant announcement. It was assumed, anticipated, internalized. Even when he was not speaking, the shape of the group began to conform to what he had made normal. This is how power consolidates, not through a single declaration, but through alignment so consistent that deviation starts to feel unnatural. By the time circumstances shifted, Shaka was no longer merely a capable subordinate inside a larger system. He was becoming a center of gravity. And once a center of gravity forms, authority begins to bend toward it, whether it is invited or not. There comes a moment when refinement stops being improvement and begins to become replacement. For Shaka, that moment did not arrive with ceremony. It arrived as a shift in gravity. The structures he had helped sharpen no longer functioned as adjustments within an existing order. They began to behave like a different order entirely, one that demanded ownership rather than permission. Circumstance accelerated what had already been forming. When Dingiswaya was killed, the protection that had buffered Shaka vanished. Borrowed authority evaporates quickly once its source disappears. What remained was not immediate chaos, but uncertainty. A question hung over the people who had depended on coordination rather than tradition. Who could hold cohesion now that the old center was gone? Shaka answered by acting. He did not appeal to lineage. He did not ask for recognition. He imposed continuity. The men who had trained under his expectations already moved differently. They understood the patterns. They trusted the structure because it had reduced uncertainty in their bodies long before it promised legitimacy in words. In moments of transition, people rarely choose what feels noble. They choose what feels stable. Shaka offered stability. Once authority settled fully into his hands, the transformation accelerated. Age regiments were reorganized, training intensified, standards hardened. Practices that had once been experimental became mandatory. Discipline was no longer a local method. It defined belonging itself. To be inside the Zulu was now to be inside the system. This declaration did not arrive as a speech or a proclamation. It arrived through enforcement, through repetition, through the quiet removal of alternatives. Customs that conflicted with cohesion were stripped away. Practices that slowed response were abandoned. Identity was no longer inherited alone. It was produced through participation. It needs consistency. When expectations remain fixed, people reorganize themselves around them. Resistance weakens not because it is crushed publicly, but because it becomes impractical privately. Fear, once diffuse, became centralized. It no longer drifted between individuals. It was embedded in the structure itself. Consequences were predictable. Deviations were costly. Order was visible and enforced without apology. To those watching from outside, this appeared brutal. To those living inside it, it appeared clarifying. Life narrowed, but it also stabilized. Roles became explicit. Uncertainty shrank. Personal judgment mattered less than adherence. The system absorbed decision-making, so individuals did not have to carry it alone. This was the trade. Shaka did not disguise it. He was not offering comfort. He was offering coherence in a world where coherence had been rare and fragile. For those who had lived through fragmentation, that coherence felt like safety, even when it demanded sacrifice. This is the moment when discipline becomes identity. The system no longer served the people. The people became components of the system. From this point on, Shaka's authority no longer depended on alignment with others. Others aligned with him because the structure he commanded had become the environment itself. To resist it was not merely to oppose a leader, it was to step outside the only order that remained intact. Power, once declared in this way, no longer requires constant assertion. It is enforced by normality, by the sense that there is no alternative configuration capable of holding. Shaka had crossed a threshold. What began as a response to insecurity had hardened into a governing principle. Discipline was no longer a tool to be applied. It was the foundation upon which everything else rested. From here forward, expansion was no longer a preference. It was a requirement, because systems built on cohesion cannot remain still for long. They either grow or they fracture under their own rigidity. Shaka chose growth. Systems that promise order always demand payment. At first, the cost is subtle. It presents itself as adjustment rather than loss. Customs tighten, rhythms compress. Old habits disappear quietly, without ceremony or protest. People tell themselves this is necessary, temporary, the unavoidable price of stability in a dangerous world. Under Shaka's rule, discipline delivered exactly what it promised. The structure functioned, and because it functioned, it spread. Training intensified. Standards hardened further. The system did not fluctuate with mood or circumstance. It applied pressure evenly, relentlessly. This was not chaos. It was consistency. But consistency has consequences. As discipline absorbed more of daily life, space for softness began to disappear. Relationships were subordinated to roles. Personal bonds mattered less than reliability. The system did not ask who you loved, what you feared, or what you needed to recover. It asked only whether you complied and whether you did so without delay. For many, this clarity felt stabilizing. Life moved forward along a single track, even when individuals were exhausted, even when doubt crept in privately. The structure carried them when they could not carry themselves. But order, once it becomes total, leaves no shelter. Those who struggled could no longer struggle quietly. Weakness was no longer a private experience. It disrupted synchronization. And disruption, inside a system built on coordination, could not be tolerated for long. Punishment sharpened. Not because Shaka sought spectacle, but because ambiguity had become dangerous. Mercy introduced unpredictability. Leniency created unevenness. Unevenness threatened cohesion, and cohesion was the foundation everything else rested on. So, discipline pressed harder. Fear, once a tool applied outward, began to settle inward, not panic, but awareness. A constant monitoring of posture, tone, timing. People learned not only how to move, but how to erase irregularity from themselves. Expression narrowed. Behavior flattened into correctness. This was the cost few spoke about. Life inside the system grew quieter, not calmer, but narrower. Laughter thinned. For Shaka, this tightening did not feel excessive. Order does not maintain itself. It must be reinforced continuously, especially when it replaces older ways of living. Any pause invites erosion. Any exception invites interpretation. Interpretation invites fracture. And fracture had consequences. Shaka understood intimately. He had lived it. He had learned what happens when protection fails, when systems hesitate, when belonging dissolves under pressure. He had no patience for structures that depended on goodwill rather than enforcement. Still, the cost accumulated. Families felt it first. Time once reserved for ritual, rest, or mourning was absorbed by readiness. Grief was shortened, celebration constrained. life bent permanently around obligation. The system did not ask how much this took. It measured only whether cohesion held. This is where discipline crosses a critical line, not into cruelty, but into indifference. The structure becomes more important than the experience of those inside it. Stability is prioritized over interior life. Function replaces feeling. People are kept intact, but rarely restored. Shaka did not frame this as sacrifice. He framed it as necessity. A world shaped by constant threat does not reward hesitation. It does not pause for healing. Order must hold, or everything collapses. This belief hardened with each success, and success made reversal increasingly unthinkable. Once people reorganize their lives around discipline, removing it feels more dangerous than enduring its weight. The system becomes familiar, its demands predictable, its costs normalized. But cohesion is not resilience. Cohesion holds people together. Resilience allows them to bend. The system Shaka built excelled at the first. The second was slowly being compressed out of existence. By the time this imbalance became visible, discipline was no longer something that could be adjusted gently. It was embedded too deeply. It defined identity, loyalty, and survival itself. The price had been paid gradually, and like most gradual costs, it was easiest to recognize only after it had already been spent. As the system tightened around everyone else, it also tightened around Shaka. Power does not only reorganize the world outward, it reorganizes the inner life of the person who holds it. The demands that discipline places on others eventually reflect back onto the one enforcing them. By this stage, Shaka was no longer surrounded by uncertainty. He was surrounded by expectation. People moved in anticipation of his standards. Decisions arrived already shaped by what they believed he would tolerate. Authority no longer required explanation. It was assumed, embedded, and constantly present. This kind of power narrows a life. There was little room left for hesitation. Doubt became dangerous, not because it weakened resolve, but because it introduced delay. Delay created inconsistency. Inconsistency threatened cohesion, and cohesion by now was everything. Shaka's personal world began to shrink. Relationships were filtered through function. Loyalty mattered more than closeness. Reliability mattered more than affection. Those nearest to him were not companions in the ordinary sense. They were extensions of the structure he guarded. This was not cruelty in the dramatic sense. It was subtraction. Anything that softened judgment, slowed response, or complicated enforcement was gradually removed. Emotional distance became a form of discipline applied inward. The same standards demanded of others were now demanded of the self. Shaka did not permit himself rest easily. To rest was to loosen vigilance. To loosen vigilance was to invite disorder. He had seen what disorder did. He had lived its consequences early enough to distrust anything that resembled it. So severity became consistency. Where others might have paused, he pressed forward. Where others might have compromised, he reinforced. Each reinforcement made the next one easier. Each act of hardness normalized the one that followed. Over time, this produced a subtle transformation. Shaka was no longer simply enforcing discipline, he was embodying it. Emotion did not disappear, but it narrowed. Expression flattened. The range of acceptable response compressed into efficiency. Reactions became calibrated, predictable. safe for the system, even when they were costly to the individual. Those around him noticed the change. He became less accessible, less flexible, less capable of being surprised without interpreting it as threat. Trust did not vanish, but it became conditional. It had to be proven continuously through alignment rather than intimacy. This isolation did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated. Power offers constant confirmation but little reassurance. Surrounded by obedience, it becomes difficult to distinguish loyalty from fear, agreement from compliance, silence from consent. The structure performs, but the human signals beneath it grow faint. Shaka responded by tightening further. If clarity eliminated doubt, then clarity must be enforced everywhere. If deviation threatened cohesion, then deviation must be removed quickly. There was no room left for ambiguity, including his own. This is the quiet danger of systems built on absolute discipline. They do not collapse under pressure. They collapse inward. The person at the center becomes increasingly alone, not because others leave, but because everything around them becomes functional, instrumental, reduced to role. Shaka's authority remained intact. His system continued to deliver results. Expansion remained possible. But something essential was being compressed out of him. Not empathy as sentiment, but elasticity, the ability to bend without breaking, to pause without fearing collapse, to tolerate difference without interpreting it as threat. By the time this hardening became visible, it was no longer a choice. It was habit. And habits formed under pressure are difficult to unlearn, especially when they continue to work. Shaka did not see this as loss. He saw it as discipline, applied correctly. But the human cost of that correctness was settling quietly into him, shaping not just how he ruled, but how he experienced the world itself. From the outside, power still looked absolute. From the inside, it was becoming increasingly rigid. And rigidity, once complete, leaves very little room for recovery. Systems built on cohesion do not remain contained. Once discipline becomes identity, expansion is no longer merely strategic, it becomes structural. The system must either grow or strain against its own limits. Stillness, in this context, feels like decay. Under Shaka, the Zulu system began to move outward. What had once been a tightly controlled internal order now pressed against neighboring spaces. Regiments that had learned to move as one carried that coordination beyond their original boundaries. Encounters with other groups were no longer isolated clashes. They became tests of whether different ways of organizing life could withstand the pressure of a system optimized for speed, unity, and decisiveness. Often, they could not. The effect was overwhelming, not because of sheer force, but because of asymmetry. Communities organized around ritual and seasonal rhythms found themselves confronting a structure designed for constant readiness. Response times differed, expectations differed, the pace alone created imbalance. Fear traveled ahead of contact. Stories moved faster than armies. Accounts of discipline, severity, and coordination spread outward, reshaping decisions before confrontation even occurred. Some groups fled, others submitted. Others attempted resistance only to discover that resistance required cohesion they did not possess. This period would later be described as upheaval, dispersal, transformation. Entire regions reorganized themselves in response to pressure that did not always arrive directly but was nevertheless felt everywhere. For Shaka, this expansion was not experienced as chaos. It was confirmation. The system worked at scale. Each successful extension reinforced the belief that cohesion was not merely a solution for insecurity, but a governing principle capable of reshaping entire landscapes. Order imposed itself outward. The same logic that had absorbed individual fear now absorbed collective uncertainty. But scale changes everything. What functions cleanly within a defined group becomes harder to regulate as it spreads. Control diffuses. Shaka responded by intensifying central authority. Standards were enforced uniformly. Deviation was corrected decisively. The logic was consistent. Uneven application would fracture cohesion. Consistency, even when harsh, would preserve it. From a distance, this appeared unstoppable. From within, it was exhausting. The system demanded constant motion, constant readiness, constant alignment. There was little room for recovery because recovery slowed expansion, and slowing expansion felt dangerous. Momentum had to be maintained or risk turning inward. Here, dominance began to carry a different weight. Power was no longer something Shaka applied deliberately. It was something the system produced automatically. Decisions made far from him still reflected his standards. Actions taken without his presence still carried his imprint. He was no longer shaping every outcome. The system was. This is the moment when authority shifts from personal to structural, when fear no longer needs a face, when discipline no longer requires explanation. It simply arrives. Shaka became less visible as an individual and more present as an influence. People adjusted behavior, not because he was watching, but because the system made alternatives unviable. Dominance at this scale feels impersonal, and impersonality carries its own dangers. As expansion continued, consequences multiplied. Displacement followed pressure. Old boundaries dissolved. New configurations formed under stress. Some groups were absorbed, others scattered. Stability existed, but unevenly, and often at great cost to those pushed to the margins. The system did not pause to account for this. Systems rarely do. Their logic is internal. They measure success by coherence and continuation, not by what is lost along the edges. Shaka understood that dominance required momentum. He also understood that momentum could not be softened without risking fragmentation. The discipline that had once protected against vulnerability now demanded constant assertion. What had begun as a solution to insecurity was now reshaping the world faster than any single person could fully oversee. This is the paradox of scale. The more effective a system becomes, the less control its creator retains over its consequences. By the time this was visible, expansion was no longer a question of choice. It was an expectation, a requirement built into the structure itself. Shaka remained at the center, but the distance between center and edge was growing, and in that growing distance cracks were beginning to form. Not yet visible, not yet decisive, but present. Scale always reveals what structure hides. As the system extended outward, it began to encounter limits that discipline alone could not erase. Not moral limits, practical ones. Resources stretched, coordination thinned, distance complicated enforcement. What had once been a tightly regulated environment became harder to hold together as it expanded across varied terrain and unfamiliar conditions. Momentum, which had once felt stabilizing, began to feel heavy. Expansion demands supply. It demands rest. It demands time. The Zulu system was built for readiness, not recovery, for movement, not pause. And as pressure accumulated, the absence of slack became visible. Warriors could move fast, but they could not replenish endlessly. Communities reorganized around obligation. But obligation does not produce food, shelter, or resilience on its own. The system assumed continuity. Reality introduced friction. Shaka responded, as he had always responded. He reinforced. Standards tightened further. Readiness was emphasized over rest. The logic was familiar. If strain appeared, cohesion must be strengthened. If resistance surfaced, discipline must be clarified. The structure could not be allowed to soften at the moment it was most exposed. But this time, reinforcement did not resolve everything. As distance increased, information degraded. Decisions made at the center arrived late at the edges. Enforcement became uneven, not because of negligence, but because scale diluted immediacy. Discipline that once operated through direct presence now relied on interpretation. Interpretation introduces variation. Variation threatens coherence. More failures began to appear. Actions that technically followed orders but missed their intent. The kind of inefficiencies that grow quietly inside expanding structures. Externally, resistance also changed shape. Groups that could not confront the system directly adapted instead. They moved, fragmented, avoided contact. Pressure no longer met opposition head-on. It dispersed into terrain, into absence, into unpredictability. Dominance over space became harder when space refused to hold still. Fear still traveled, but it no longer resolved outcomes cleanly. For Shaka, this was a different challenge. Discipline had been designed to eliminate uncertainty. Now, uncertainty was being produced by the very scale that discipline had enabled. The system was encountering complexity rather than disorder, and complexity does not yield to force in the same way. This created tension, not panic, but irritation, the sense that clarity was being diluted, that standards were being followed imperfectly, that outcomes required adjustment rather than enforcement. Adjustment was not Shaka's instinct. He had built coherence by narrowing options, not by expanding them. When pressure increased, his response was to compress further, to demand sharper alignment, to remove flexibility before it could become fracture. This worked locally, but system-wide, the strain persisted. The structure continued to function, but at a higher cost. Energy was expended maintaining alignment rather than extending stability. Momentum became something that had to be pushed rather than carried. This is the moment where dominance begins to encounter reality. Not in defeat, but in resistance that cannot be eliminated, only managed. Shaka remained decisive. His authority was not in question, but the relationship between command and outcome had changed. Control was no longer immediate. Consequences lagged. Enforcement required repetition. These delays mattered. They introduced noise into a system built on precision. As pressure mounted, the margin for error shrank further. Deviations that might once have been absorbed now threatened cascading effects. The structure demanded even greater vigilance to maintain the same level of cohesion it had once achieved more easily. From the outside, dominance still appeared intact. From within, effort was increasing. The system was still moving forward, but it was no longer moving effortlessly. The question was no longer whether the system worked. It was how long it could continue working without turning its pressure inward. That question did not yet have an answer, but it was beginning to insist on being asked. When a system stops responding cleanly to pressure, attention turns inward. For Shaka, The growing strain did not register as failure. It registered as risk. The structure still held, but it no longer held effortlessly. Outcomes lagged. Alignment required repetition. Deviations, once rare, became more visible as scale stretched, enforcement thin. Visibility changes how power behaves. Uncertainty that once lived outside the system now appeared inside it, not as rebellion, but as inconsistency. Orders followed imperfectly, standards applied unevenly. Results that once felt inevitable now required correction. Shaka interpreted this not as complexity, but as vulnerability. The response was familiar. Tighten. If clarity was eroding, it must be restored. If discipline was being diluted, it must be sharpened. If loyalty could no longer be assumed, it had to be demonstrated. This was the turning point. Control, which had once been directed outward to impose order, began to redirect itself inward to preserve it. Trust narrowed, not vanished, but conditional. It became something that had to be reaffirmed constantly through behavior rather than granted through position. The system did not announce this shift. It was felt. People adjusted their speech, their posture, their timing, not because a rule had changed, but because the margin for misreading had thinned. Where ambiguity once existed, suspicion crept in to fill the gap. For Shaka, this vigilance felt justified. A structure built on cohesion cannot afford internal drift. Fracture does not begin with open revolt. It begins with misalignment, with small deviations that spread quietly until they become impossible to contain. So Shaka watched more closely. He listened for inconsistency. He looked for hesitation disguised as caution. Loyalty was no longer measured only by action, but by speed, enthusiasm, and precision. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was fear reorganized, fear of erosion, fear of dilution, fear that the system, once proven effective, might fail if it softened at the wrong moment. As vigilance increased, the cost became personal. Relationships strained under scrutiny. Familiar figures became suspect. Proximity to power no longer guaranteed safety. In fact, it increased exposure. Now uncertainty had reappeared inside it, and the only available response was to compress further, to narrow the field of acceptable behavior until deviation became impossible. But compression has limits. People reported what they believed was expected, not what was observed. Candor thinned. Fear altered communication. The system still functioned, but it began to lose accurate feedback. Shaka sensed this, but had no alternative framework. He had built order by removing ambiguity, not by tolerating it. The tools that had once stabilized the system were now being applied to preserve it at all costs. This is how paranoia enters power. Not as madness, but as vigilance without rest. Shaka did not feel unhinged. He felt responsible for holding a structure that no longer carried itself, responsible for preventing collapse by any means necessary. But responsibility without relief hardens quickly. By this stage, trust had narrowed to a thin channel. Loyalty was expected, but never fully confirmed. Authority remained absolute, yet increasingly isolated. The system still moved. But it was no longer relaxed in its motion. It moved under watch. And once power begins watching itself too closely, It rarely notices when the watching becomes the threat. Power does not always isolate loudly. More often, it does so by subtraction. If anything, the structure looks stronger than ever, as if strain had only sharpened it. But proximity had changed. Those closest to him no longer spoke with ease. Speech became measured, shaped by anticipation rather than candor. Advice arrived, wrapped in caution, the space around him filled with agreement but thinned of reassurance. Even loyalty began to feel like performance when it could not be expressed freely. This is the quiet loneliness of authority. When alignment becomes mandatory, presence loses warmth. People remain nearby, but they arrive as roles rather than companions. Every interaction carries consequence. Every word risks interpretation. Familiarity erodes under scrutiny, until the ruler is left with faces, not relationships. Shaka did not interpret this as tragedy. He interpreted it as order. To relax vigilance would have felt irresponsible. The system still required holding. Expansion still demanded coordination. Any softening at the center risked sending ambiguity outward, and ambiguity had always been the first crack through which disorder entered. So isolation became functional. Decisions were made alone. Doubt was processed internally. There was little space for uncertainty that did not immediately have to resolve into action. In a structure built on constant readiness, there is no safe place for hesitation to rest. The death of his mother, Nandi, intensified this narrowing. Grief, which might have forced a human pause, was instead disciplined. Mourning became rule. Expression became regulated. Even loss was absorbed into structure, not because Shaka wanted to appear strong, but because consistency had become his only reliable language. The system did not stop for grief. It could not. To pause would have been to invite erosion at the edges, and erosion, once begun, spreads. His standards did not soften. The structure continued moving because it had been built to keep moving. But containment exacts its own cost. Without places where uncertainty can breathe, uncertainty hardens. Without trusted contradiction, judgment becomes circular. The ruler hears echoes of his own standards reflected back at him, reinforced, never tested. Information begins to warp, not through lies necessarily, but through selection. People report what they believe is safest to report. Candor becomes a risk. This is how isolation deepens, not through abandonment, but through over-occupation. Shaka was never alone in the physical sense. He was alone in the cognitive one. There were few places left where disagreement could land without consequence, few places left where the human could exist without being interpreted as weakness. Authority still worked. But it worked inward now. The system demanded constant attention, constant calibration, constant reinforcement. There was no margin left for being off-duty. No interior space unclaimed by responsibility. From the inside, it was becoming increasingly enclosed. This is the paradox of control. The more completely a system depends on one person to hold it together, the less room that person has to remain fully human inside it. By now, isolation was no longer something imposed by others. It was a posture Shaka had learned to maintain himself, and once learned, it rarely loosens on its own. When a system becomes larger than the person who built it, the person's ending rarely feels complete. Shaka's death did not arrive with the kind of closure history often prefers. There was no final scene where power resolved itself neatly into meaning. What followed instead was interruption, removal, absence. He was killed by those closest to him, not as a theatrical overthrow, but as a practical act, a response to pressure that had nowhere else to go. Authority that had become too rigid to adapt was not reformed from within, it was cut away. The system survived the act, the person did not. What ended that day was not discipline itself, but the particular configuration of discipline that required Shaka's constant presence to hold it together. The structure he built was powerful, but it was also centralized. Its coherence depended on a single gravity. Once that gravity vanished, everything else shifted quickly and without permission. And then, almost immediately, control moved into narrative. Shaka's death was explained, justified. The same qualities that had once been defended as necessary were now recast as excess. Severity became madness, vigilance became cruelty, discipline became pathology. Responsibility was compressed into a single character so the wider system could keep moving without having to account for itself. This is how myth begins. Not as pure invention, but as simplification under stress. History does not preserve systems in their full complexity, it preserves symbols. Shaka was transformed from a governing presence into a story that could travel without the burden of nuance, a figure easier to condemn or admire than to understand. For some, he became a monster, for others, a visionary. Both readings flattened him. In myth, extremes feel satisfying. They offer clarity. They allow listeners to land emotionally without carrying contradiction. But clarity often arrives by removing causality. The violence of Shaka's reign is separated from the pressures that produced it. The discipline he imposed is detached from the insecurity it answered. The slow progression from vulnerability to control is replaced by a faster, cleaner conclusion. This process is not accidental. Myth makes power legible. By compressing a life into a small number of features, history makes authority portable. It becomes a lesson, a warning, an emblem, a name that can be invoked quickly without having to reopen the uncomfortable question of how such systems form. Shaka became useful in this way. He could be pointed to as explanation. His name could stand in for brutality, without requiring examination of the conditions that reward it. His story could end decisively, even if the forces he set in motion did not. Because systems rarely die with their architects. The structures Shaka built were altered afterward, adapted, softened in some places, hardened in others. Leadership changed, methods shifted. But the underlying logic, cohesion prioritized above comfort, discipline treated as identity, fear used as stabilizer, did not vanish. It redistributed itself among new hands, new interpretations, new necessities. Shaka's absence made this redistribution easier. Without the person, responsibility blurred. Decisions could be attributed to circumstance rather than will. The system could continue operating while quietly disowning its origin. It could keep the effectiveness and shed the discomfort of acknowledging what it cost. It persists because it works, even when its costs are no longer openly named. It becomes ordinary, normal, the kind of structure people stop noticing until it fails. Shaka, as a human being, could not follow his system into this afterlife. He became an object of memory instead, a fixed image where complexity had once existed, a shorthand for severity. a name spoken with certainty rather than curiosity. Over time, this certainty hardens, because repeating a story is easier than re-entering the conditions that produced it. But certainty is rarely accurate. What gets lost in myth is not just balance, it is causality, the slow accumulation of pressure, the adaptations that harden into principles, the way survival strategies become governing philosophies, the way a system can begin as protection and end as confinement. Shaka's death closed a life. It did not close the story. It shifted the story from action into interpretation, where meaning is cheaper, where judgment moves faster, and where responsibility is easier to assign to one person than to an entire structure. And between the two, the human was almost entirely erased. Shaka does not belong only to the past. What ended with his death was a life, not a logic. The conditions that shaped his rule did not vanish when his body did. They changed form. They traveled. They learned how to wear new language, new structures, and new justifications. This is how power survives history. The world Shaka lived in was defined by instability. Belonging was fragile. Threat was constant. Delay carried consequences. In such environments, systems that reduce uncertainty are rewarded, even when they are harsh. Discipline feels protective. Coordination feels safe. Control feels like foresight. That equation has not disappeared. It reappears whenever pressure rises faster than trust can keep up, whenever complexity overwhelms shared understanding, whenever groups feel exposed and time feels scarce. In those moments, order becomes attractive again, not as domination, but as relief. Modern systems rarely resemble Shaka's on the surface. They do not march in regiments or enforce discipline through ritualized violence. But the underlying logic often remains recognizable. Efficiency is prized over deliberation. Alignment is valued more than dissent. Speed is rewarded more than recovery. These preferences are rarely announced as ideology. They present themselves as necessity, as pragmatism, as the only way to hold things together when uncertainty multiplies and margins disappear. This is where Shaka's relevance sharpens, not as a template to copy, not as a cautionary tale to dismiss, but as a clear illustration of how discipline behaves when it is allowed to answer every question. His system worked because it responded to real conditions. It did not arise from abstraction or theory. It arose from lived insecurity. That is what made it powerful, and that is what made it difficult to reverse. Because systems born under pressure tend to preserve the memory of that pressure long after circumstances change. They continue enforcing solutions even when the original threat has shifted or faded. They confuse consistency with safety, control with stability. In the modern world, this can look like constant urgency, permanent readiness, cultures that treat rest as inefficiency, structures that reward obedience while quietly penalizing deviation, environments where hesitation is interpreted as weakness and reflection as delay. None of this requires a single ruler. It emerges from alignment, from shared assumptions about what must be protected at all costs, from collective agreement that cohesion matters more than elasticity, from the belief that order, once achieved, must never be loosened. Shaka's story becomes relevant, not when we ask whether he was justified, but when we recognize how easily his logic reappears wherever fear outpaces trust. This pattern is not confined to states or armies. It surfaces in institutions under strain, in organizations facing collapse, in communities that feel surrounded by threat or scarcity. The tools differ, the language softens, but the structure remains familiar. Discipline becomes identity, compliance becomes belonging, deviation becomes risk. Over time, people stop asking why the system exists. They start asking how well they fit inside it. Success is measured by alignment, stability by uniformity, difference by disruption. What Shaka's life reveals is not the inevitability of brutality, but the gradual narrowing of possibility when discipline is allowed to dominate without counterbalance. His system excelled at cohesion. It struggled with resilience. It could hold people together. It could not always let them bend. That distinction matters. Cohesion feels strong. It produces visible order. It creates momentum. Resilience is quieter. It tolerates pause. It absorbs difference. It allows recovery without collapse. Systems optimized for one often sacrifice the other without noticing, until stress exposes the gap. Shaka did not invent this trade. He embodied it. And because he embodied it so completely, his story allows us to see the pattern with unusual clarity. It shows how quickly necessity can become justification, how survival strategies harden into governing philosophies, how systems that begin as protection can slowly turn into confinement. The modern world does not need another Shaka, but it continues to generate conditions where Shaka-like logic feels reasonable, where order is elevated above everything else, where discipline becomes the default response to uncertainty. That is what endures. Not the man, not the myth, but the assumption that cohesion must come first, even when it steadily reduces the space where human complexity can breathe. Recognizing that assumption does not tell us what to do. It simply reminds us what we are choosing when we accept it. Every system reveals its limits, not when it fails, but when it succeeds too completely. Shaka's model was built to solve a specific problem. It was designed to impose cohesion in a world where fragmentation carried real danger. Discipline answered insecurity. Coordination reduced exposure. Order stabilized uncertainty. For a time, it worked remarkably well, but no model remains neutral as it scales. What begins as a solution gradually becomes an assumption. What once required justification becomes normal, and once normal, it stops being questioned. This is where Shaka's system encountered its limits. It excelled at producing cohesion. It struggled to produce adaptability. The structure rewarded alignment above all else. Deviation was treated as threat. Flexibility as weakness. Over time, this narrowed the range of acceptable behavior until variation itself became dangerous. The system could move quickly, but it could not easily change direction. That rigidity mattered, because environments change, threats evolve, conditions shift. What once demanded speed may later require patience. What once required compression may later require elasticity. Systems that cannot loosen when pressure changes eventually turn their strength inward. Discipline flowed from a single source. Standards were enforced through proximity to power. This allowed for precision, but it also concentrated responsibility. When decisions bottleneck, resilience declines. There was no clear mechanism for correction. Disagreement was filtered out long before it reached the center. Feedback softened under fear. Information arrived shaped by expectation rather than reality. The system still functioned, but it increasingly relied on repetition rather than learning. This is a critical limitation. Cohesion without feedback produces stability without insight. It holds form while losing awareness. Over time, such systems become excellent at preserving themselves, even when the conditions that justified them have changed. Shaka's rule did not collapse because it was ineffective. It encountered limits because it left little room for renewal. Succession was unclear. Authority was personal rather than distributed. The system had been optimized to function around one gravity, not to survive its absence. When that gravity disappeared, continuity required reinterpretation rather than inheritance. This is not unusual. Systems built under pressure often prioritize immediacy over longevity. They solve the present problem decisively, but struggle to imagine a future where that solution is no longer appropriate. Shaka's model assumed perpetual readiness. It treated rest as risk, recovery as delay. Over time, this exhausted not only people, but possibilities. When every moment is structured, there is little space left for adaptation to emerge organically. None of this makes the system irrational. It makes it bounded. The logic that produced discipline also constrained imagination. Order was valued so highly that alternatives felt irresponsible. They deliver results precisely because they reduce complexity. But complexity does not disappear. It waits. And when it returns, simplified systems often struggle to respond. Shaka's model could absorb fear. It could not easily absorb difference. That distinction is crucial. Difference introduces information. It reveals blind spots. It tests assumptions. Systems that suppress difference gain short-term cohesion at the cost of long-term flexibility. By the time this tension became visible, adjustment was difficult. Discipline had become identity. To loosen it felt like erasing the very thing that had held everything together. Shaka did not fail to see these limits. He was constrained by them. His system was built for survival under pressure, not for ease. It produced strength, not comfort, stability, not openness. Those outcomes were not accidental. They were chosen. Understanding the limits of his model does not require condemnation. It requires clarity. Because what Shaka's life ultimately demonstrates is not the danger of discipline itself, but the danger of discipline without counterweight, of cohesion without elasticity, of order without space for renewal. His system answered the question. It was built to answer. It could not answer every question that followed. Stories often end where meaning feels complete. This one does not. Shaka's life resists clean resolution, not because it lacks clarity, but because it exposes a tension that never fully disappears. The same forces that shaped him continue to shape systems long after his name fades from immediate relevance. Fear did not create him alone. Discipline did not corrupt him alone. Power did not distort him suddenly. Each emerged slowly, in response to conditions that made other options feel unsafe. What Shaka reveals is not the inevitability of cruelty, but the seduction of coherence. When the world feels unstable, order becomes attractive. When belonging feels fragile, alignment feels protective. When survival is uncertain, control begins to feel like foresight rather than force. These dynamics are not confined to history. They surface wherever pressure narrows imagination, wherever speed replaces deliberation, wherever systems reward consistency more than elasticity. In such environments, discipline becomes identity, not because people are coerced, but because it works. He ruled through structure, and structure, once normalized, rarely feels like domination to those living inside it. It feels like the way things are done, the only way they can be done. Alternatives begin to feel irresponsible, even dangerous. This is why judgment alone feels insufficient. To reduce Shaka to villain or hero is to miss what made him effective. It is to substitute moral certainty for understanding. And certainty, while comforting, prevents recognition. What endures from his life is not a model to follow, but a pattern to notice. The pattern begins with vulnerability. It moves through discipline. It consolidates as identity. And it hardens into structure. At each stage, the choices made feel reasonable in isolation. It is only in accumulation that their cost becomes visible. Shaka did not wake one morning as something other than human. He adapted, he refined, he reinforced. Each step reduced uncertainty. Each step narrowed possibility. None of them, taken alone, demanded reversal. That is how systems grow heavy, not through dramatic turns, but through consistency without counterweight. The story closes here, not because the questions are answered, but because they are now visible. What we do with them remains unresolved. It always does. Shaka's life shows what happens when order becomes the primary response to fear, and when discipline is allowed to define belonging. It shows how quickly survival strategies can become governing principles, and how difficult they are to loosen once they succeed. There is no final judgment waiting at the end of this arc. Only recognition. Recognition that power often looks most convincing when it arrives quietly, that systems built to protect can also confine, that stability and humanity do not always grow at the same pace, and that understanding these dynamics does not require agreement or condemnation, only attention, because once you see the pattern, it does not belong to history alone. It belongs to any moment where fear, order, and ambition meet and are allowed to settle without question. Long after the system moved on, the question remained. Not the question of whether Shaka was right or wrong, not the question of whether his methods should be praised or condemned. Those are easier questions. The harder one lingers beneath them. What kind of conditions make his choices feel reasonable in the first place? Shaka's life does not ask to be copied. It asks to be noticed. It reveals how quickly fear reorganizes values, how easily discipline becomes synonymous with safety, how order, once effective, begins to justify itself without needing to explain its cost. These shifts do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly. In small decisions made under pressure, in trade-offs accepted as temporary, in rules tightened just a little more than before, no single moment feels decisive. Only later does the shape become clear. This is why Shaka's story continues to matter, even when the world looks nothing like his. The materials have changed. The scale has changed. The language has softened. But the pattern remains familiar. When uncertainty grows faster than trust, people reach for structure. When belonging feels fragile, alignment becomes comfort. When disorder threatens, control begins to feel like responsibility. None of this requires cruelty to begin. It requires urgency. and urgency narrows imagination. The lesson, if there is one, is not about rejecting order or discipline outright. It is about noticing when they stop being tools and start becoming identities, when cohesion is preserved at the expense of elasticity, when stability becomes more important than the lives held inside it. Shaka did not invent this tension. He lived inside it. And because he lived it so fully, his story leaves us with something more valuable than instruction. It leaves us with awareness. Awareness that power often feels most justified when it is responding to real fear. That systems rarely announce when they begin to overreach. And that the cost of order is easiest to ignore when it is paid gradually. Nothing here tells us what to choose. It only reminds us that choices are being made even when they feel inevitable, and that paying attention to those moments before they harden into structure may be the only freedom such systems ever leave behind.